Hello, and welcome to InstaQuest. I'm JoBo, our resident DM here, and joining me today is Literary Joe.
How's it going?
Today we're going to be going over doing a little bit of a game mastering workshop, how to become a better game master for your Dungeons and Dragons and/or other role-playing games. Yeah, so what's your experience like with Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop role-playing games?
So personally, I think I started I started back when I was in high school for my first experience, and I can't remember if it was 3.0 or if it was 3.5 at the time. Um, but I know like when I first started playing, I think it was 3.0, and I didn't actually get into it till it was 3.5. So that
Okay.
was when I first started, and I actually um, uh, one of the earliest campaigns I did was a Fallout campaign, which is funny because my friend who like makes board games, tabletop games, he had put together built characters around like different things put together like and super mutant as like based on like an orc, things like that,
Oh,
and
nice.
you could be different things, and it was really cool. um but that's not the point. I want to know what your experience is with D&D. When did you start? What version was it? And tell me a little bit about like how many games have you run versus how many have you played as a player.
I guess my actual my first exposure to D&D really was the Baldur's Gate computer RPG from back in the day. And
Yeah,
I didn't even really know what a Forgotten Realms or a Dungeons and Dragons really was then. So I was just like, "Oh, these are cool stats that I can make like a wizard character and I can do all these cool things." And I guess the next kind of one where it started setting in that there's using some kind of system between these games was Knights of the Old Republic,
yeah,
which is like kind of a 3E hack kind of they used in that game.
yeah.
Um, and,
KOTOR.
and it wasn't actually until fourth edition that I actually started playing D&D myself. I didn't have a group of friends who played it or anything like that, so I never got like pulled into it. Although my drama teacher in high school did have I think when 4E came out, he had like the player's handbook on his desk at one point. I'm like, what is that? What's that going on over there?
Nice.
Um, so what got me into it and got me thinking, oh hey, I can do that was a series of podcasts put out by Wizards of the Coast with Penny Arcade, which became
Oh,
their
nice.
whole Acquisitions Incorporated. So that was my first exposure to like actual D&D was the 4E with that. And From there I like went on to actually run a campaign for a few years with some friends of mine. I managed to convince them to buy in and make characters and stuff. And that game went for like 3 years or so.
Yeah.
It was a really long one. We only got to like level like 8 or so. It was a like a once a month kind of group. So
And that's the thing, like as a DM, what level do you like to start your PCs at, your player characters? Because I know personally, there's been a lot of campaigns that I've played maybe up to like 10 sit downs, and you only get so high of a level. I've never maxed out a character.
yeah,
So
me
I'm
neither.
curious, where what as a DM, do you like to start your players in that world at like a level 5 or at a higher level, or do you start everybody off from scratch?
It really depends on the group. Depending on the number of like newer players or like what kind of experience we're going for. Um, a lot of the times, if I do start as like a level 1 campaign, that'll be with like newer players, people who haven't really played D&D before, or if it's like a module that like starts at first level and I'm running a module that I haven't written that's just like a pre-written one. Um, but my preferred kind of starting place would be like third level in fifth edition if we were going to be going with that. Third level is like where your character really kind of by third level every class is like pick their subclass. So you're not just a rogue anymore. You're an assassin. You're not
Yeah.
just a barbarian anymore. You're like a spirit barbarian or whatever. So that really helps like kind of like round out a character. Like if you have like a concept at level one, you're just like maybe less than 10 hit points guy walking around. One bad roll and it's all over for you.
Yeah.
So third level, you get one the survivability and two a little bit more depth and nuance to the character.
And I think I had seen a video that you were talking about. There's clerics sometimes where based on like the ranks that someone has, they can get revived when they die versus just having to create a whole new character from scratch. Do you like to implement that as a DM, or do you leave it up to like if you're dead, you got to start a brand new character?
I mean, there's it's tricky with D&D, especially when you start getting into higher levels. Like death becomes a little bit of like a road bump. Um,
Yeah,
Although there are some classes that are built around that, like the zealot subclass for barbarians. One of their big features is that for a revival spell, you don't need to spend any of the expensive reagents. You don't need a bunch of diamonds to revive a zealot barbarian. So if you had a zealot barbarian in your campaign, you're like, no, there's no resurrection magic. They're like, well, come on, man, what are you doing? I rolled this class just for this thing.
yeah.
But I mean, on the other hand, if this happened in a game I was playing in that was like 12th level, like we had this epic fight, and the kobold like sacrificed himself to save everybody, and we're just like, all right, whatever. We picked him up, throw him in a bag, like bring him over to the local church, like, hey, we got a broken kobold, can you fix this thing? And like we were just like we were so this is after like post we had done all of Tomb of Annihilation, and we had just amassed tons of wealth from that. And they're like, oh yes, 100 platinum pieces. Like, oh yeah, whatever. Boom, here you go. Yeah, bring them back. Come on. So it's tricky because the mechanisms for D&D allow for death to just become like a speed bump like that. But at that point, you've also invested so much into the characters at that point.
Yeah,
So death in a game really comes down to what I like to do is I'll sit down with the player and be like, hey, you know, do you want to re-roll or do you want to keep playing this character? Do you want to see what goes on with their story? And typically, if somebody's being brought back from the dead, I like to make it cost a little bit more, maybe like add some complications to them coming back. Maybe they're like now indebted to some extraplanar spirit, or maybe they owe an organization a lot of money that brought them back. Like make it not just like, oh, you
you
know,
can die and come back anytime you want.
yeah,
Like that's too easy. I totally get what you're saying. What's the most interesting way you've seen a character die? Because the thing about D&D is you can do anything. It's your imagination that limits you. So what's the most out of the box way you've ever seen a character meet their end, whether it's a sacrifice or not? Because the thing is, when a character sacrifices themselves, as far as for sake of the story, bringing that character back kind of overwrites the whole purpose. If you got a character like a paladin or somebody to sacrifice themselves for a purpose, story wise, they should be rolling a new character.
exactly,
So
exactly. And I mean, and in the rules, it also says like, oh, the spirit could not be willing to come back to the body, and that's me like whispering like, hey, your paladin went out really cool. You want him to actually get res? No, okay. Sorry, the res spell didn't work. His spirit's moved on. It's finished its goal. Um,
yeah,
but the wildest way I've seen something get taken out actually was it was this rogue. It was actually in a dragon heist campaign, and
mm,
in that module, you're trying to track down this one MacGuffin, and the party had finally gotten it, and the sleazy rogue had been double crossing him the whole time, and he ran off with it. And there was like a kobold encounter they ran into, and that rogue, after double
more
crossing the entire
kobolds.
party, just complete karma right away. Instantly got crit 3 times by kobolds, and just like shivved in an alleyway. Just
What is it
that.
with you and kobolds?
I mean, they're around. They're around a bit. The one I was talking about before was a player character, but this was just happened to be
uh,
kobolds in an alleyway taking out a rogue.
Fair.
Just with some karmic crits that came through.
I gotcha. Now, as far as as far as like interesting deaths, it's funny. I think there was one time that I was telling Lexi and Utahime about this. I had two bags of holding, and so my character was like a paladin. He was on this mountain. He like goes like rode into like this thousands of zombies of this horde or whatever, and just sticks one bag of holding and the other bag of holding, and so like time and space collapse on itself, and like there was just a hole in existence after that. And
uh,
like I like in that situation, I can't bring my character back. I have to start over, and
exactly.
that's fun. We were talking a little bit about the different like 5e and everything. I had a question. When people say Pathfinder, is that a specific rule set? Is that still D&D, or is that another tabletop game? Because I feel like as far as like newer players go, they don't really understand what that means.
Yeah, so Pathfinder is a similar but legally distinct game to Dungeons and Dragons. The original Pathfinder is based off an older version of Dungeons and Dragons called 3.5, 3.5 edition, um, which is a bit. So 3.5e is a bit more complicated than 5e. There's a lot more like feats and player options and nuance to the skills, and then Pathfinder just like doubled down on that. It's more feats, it's more skills, it's more nuance, more kind of like granular character creation. So in Pathfinder, you can make like a really cool. You can get more dialed in on a concept. Like even by like first level, you can have some unique things about your character. Um, Although second edition Pathfinder actually just came out recently, and I haven't gotten a chance to really thumb through that too much. I looked at one of the playtests, and it seems pretty cool. It's a bit more streamlined than first edition Pathfinder, but it's also really different than Dungeons and Dragons. They made a lot of changes to it that I remember combat being like a bit more nuanced. But I really need to go back and check that out because it seems like a cool thing.
Yeah. And so as a DM, I guess I want to ask you a little bit more from a DM standpoint. You obviously not only do you have to like make the laws and like keep everything intact for the world, but you have to create the world. Unless you're like running a rule set like based on a pre built campaign, you're building the entire world. So how do you kind of help yourself envision that? Like for people, I guess for people who are trying to run a campaign who have maybe not as grand of an imagination, what would you recommend for them to put something together?
If you're just getting started out DMing, I definitely recommend a module. There's a lot of really great ones out that are published by Wizards of the Coast. Um, Things like Tomb of Annihilation is actually a really good one for like a longer campaign. A shorter one like Dragon Heist. For even shorter, Ghost of Saltmarsh is a collection of like really short adventures, all kind of like sort of linked together. A lot of those have like a nautical theme to them. But if you want to make your own campaign, if you want to, like make your own campaign world and tell your own story in there, I'd say some things to focus on are to like start local. Um, think about like where your characters, your player characters are going to be starting and like the immediate story around there, and then you can build out from there. So you can kind of think of things like in terms of circles. So you have like your like really close circle, like here's the town they started and everything going on there. If you can figure that out, you can run a game. That's enough for one session at least. And then as it goes
Nice.
on, you can figure out more and more. Maybe you can start with like a big picture. Maybe you can start with like, oh, here's the big theme, the big concept for the game, and you can come down a little bit. Okay, here's the continent they're on, here's the kingdom they're in, and here's the town. So you want to fill in the most on like a little bit, but you also have like a little bit of a big picture going on. I mean, you can set
So
that.
like it's like you're playing Grand Theft Auto. You got to unlock the map as you go.
I mean, yeah, there are some benefits to you know having a wider scale idea before going in, being able to have like a concept or theme for your world, but don't get too caught up in like all the minutia. Don't write a 100-page thesis about a kingdom on the other side of the world that the players might never even get to or talk to. I mean, there's nothing wrong if you want to do that, but that's going to end up being like a lot of prep that might not make it into the campaign that you're running at the time. But
Might
on the
kind of sour the game for you too.
A little bit, yeah, yeah. But on the plus side, nothing you ever prep as a DM is ever really wasted. Everything can be recycled and reused and retrofitted and slammed in somewhere else. So I mean, any sort of prep or designing or things you do, even if they don't get used in the campaign, still can be valuable. Just don't just if you're new to DMing and you're just starting out, don't worry too much about having everything figured out. It's okay
Okay.
to like figure it out as you go. That's part of the play. Or one of the reasons why we play is to find out what happens. Like
Yeah.
if you've got the entire thing figured out and planned and scrutinized, then what are you rolling the dice for? What's going on? We play the game to figure out what happens, and
Yeah.
that's what the fun of the game all is.
Definitely. Now, I'm curious since we're talking about from a world building standpoint, how do you approach that as a storyteller. Obviously, like you have to look at whatever you're looking at, whatever you have planned for these characters. You kind of have to have branching stories because you don't know what decisions they're going to make, um, but you still have to be prepared for like general decisions that the characters, I guess, lead the plot. So how broad of a story do you have to tell or get prepared ahead of a session? Um, Obviously, you've kind of explained you start small with the city, town, whatever. But as far as like uh, for the characters that you're not creating, um, how do you write that world?
Yeah, it's tricky because the players need to be the most important characters in the setting, at least to the story.
Yeah.
So working with your players to kind of like incorporate their backstories and everything into whatever plot you had unfolding is very important, kind of beforehand. I like to call them knives. I ask my players to hand me knives that I can stab their characters in the back with. Um, because that always
That's fun.
leads to interesting things going on with them. But for an overall planning standpoint, it's important to know that any concrete plan isn't going to survive, contact with the enemy, I guess is the phrase.
Yeah.
Um, when the rubber hits the road and the players start going, I mean they're gonna tell you what they want to do. Like they're gonna get into some shenanigans.
Hmm.
You might have to. I mean, all you can really worry about is what you have control over. Like whenever I'm running a campaign, I like to think of what the major NPCs and villains and heroes are doing, and have their actions inflict consequences upon the player characters. So even if they run away, if they go over to the next town or whatever, like, oh, the feudal lord there is dealing with the fallout of the zombie invasion, so he doesn't have the guards there, and he asks them to help out with some guard work, and that kind of like ties back in. You got to subtly like push them towards the main story, and I mean there's a little bit of like a social contract between everybody sitting and playing Dungeons and Dragons that the DM has something prepared, and if we want to have a cool adventure, we'll follow the hooks. Um, there's some players that will actively rebel against that.
Yeah.
I mean that could be fun in its own right, but if you're trying to tell like a grand narrative, there needs to be a little bit of buy-in on that. Alternatively, you could, if you have a group that doesn't really want to follow the railroad at all, so to say, you can run like sandbox type games.
Hmm.
Those require a bit more prep in my opinion because you need to just like set up a lot of interesting places that they could wander across and hope they wander across it.
Yeah.
Um, I've never actually really run a very long like sandbox type game. Those I don't know. I always have nicer players that'll buy into my narratives.
Gotcha. Um, so as far as like as a DM, you are you are the omnipotence. You make the rules. So I guess how often do you behind the scenes, behind the DM screen, do you have to tip the die or like weigh a role based on how you need the story to progress? Do you let everything do you leave everything up to the roll of the die, or do you kind of behind the scenes add or take away from roles based on how characters are playing or how well the characters are being played by the PCs are being played by the players?
Yeah, so this is an eternal debate. Should you fudge rolls or not? Um, there's great arguments for either side, but me personally, I fall on the side of I always roll out in the open. Um, so there's not even a chance for me to fudge it. It's like, oh, there's the die roll right there, because that's part of playing the game is you play to figure out what happens. And
Gotcha.
if you already had something figured out and planned, then what are you rolling the dice for? I mean, there are situations though that like, oh, the heroes are you have like one little encounter before the final boss, and they all get killed by like a kobold or something. Like it's not very like a heroic, it's not a very satisfying end. Like there's definitely situations where you can be tempted to tip the dice like that, to do a little DM fiat and smudge it a little bit, but I'm not a fan of that. I always prefer just playing the game, and whatever happens happens. Like
Nice.
sometimes things get complicated, and somebody's not going to make it out of the adventure alive. And that's just the thing you have to roll with and decide narratively how that makes sense. And I mean, even if a character gets killed, you can always be like, oh, a demonic entity has summoned you back into the realm, and you're back in flesh with a strange brand on your forearm. And there you go. You got a hook for another thing going on, and your character's back. Um,
How much do you think is important as far as like I feel like once we got to 5E, the alignment chart became a little less strict and a little less important. Do you how much do you how much weight do you feel like characters' decisions have, or the players' decisions have, based on the alignments that their characters are supposed to be? Do you kind of behold them to that, or do you let them just kind of go? Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah. Like alignment was a big deal in third edition and before. Fourth edition, it got like completely gutted. They cut it down to fourth edition alignment chart was just like, are you good, evil, or nothing? Um, and the whole the law of chaos axis kind of went away, but they brought that back in fifth edition, mostly just as like homage for some nostalgia. Mechanically, there's almost nothing that happens with alignment anymore, but it's still like a good way to like think about your character. Like, oh, is my character one who follows the law or follows their own impulses? Are they somebody who thinks about helping only themselves or helping people in need? Um, and if somebody is playing against their alignment, like in the session, um, like I don't know, like why do you need to beat them over the head at that? Like I think it's trying to pigeonhole characters like into the alignment and saying, oh, you must stay this alignment, you shall not pass either other way. It's kind of like pigeonholing your character and doesn't allow for growth or change. Like alignment change was a thing in previous editions when alignment was like a bigger deal, but that was always there's like you'd like lose class levels or something for it.
Yeah,
I guess the only class really now that would come up with is a paladin, and
true,
in
true.
5e paladins, ironically, they don't even take an oath until like third level, which is another reason to start at third level.
Yeah,
But the only mechanical ramifications of that is you can like lose access to your oath stuff if you're consistently breaking it. There's no real hard and fast rules for that. And the paladin oath kind of tenets you're supposed to follow are nebulous enough that I've never really seen them come up in a game. Um,
gotcha.
so for me personally, alignment just is more a thought experiment than anything in 5e.
Okay. How do you? I know personally, as a player, I know it's really easy to get distracted, especially if I'm playing with a group of friends. What do you do to kind of help your players as a DM? What do you do to help them stay in character, stay in that world? How do you guide them back into the fantasy realm?
So keeping people on task is a tricky part of DMing. One thing I like to do is give enough time at the beginning of the session for people to be like, "Oh, hey, how are you? What were you up to last weekend? Oh, what have you been going on?" In my groups, we like to call it tea time. We're just
Uh,
sitting around drinking the tea for a little bit. I've I've had some sessions where it's like 2 hours of tea, and then like, are we gonna roll some dice today? Nah, whatever. Which isn't the advice you want to get. So,
right.
keeping people on task can be a little bit tricky. I know people have all their phones and everything nowadays, and especially with how the world is nowadays, playing online, you have infinite distractions at your hand.
Yeah.
Like you've got your Roll20 tab open, but oh, I've got Twitter over here, and oh, what's this on Discord, and oh, hey, oh, what's this over here? um, Keeping people engaged and interested has never been harder, because everything's all digital now, and especially if you don't have like cameras on people, if you're just doing it over voice and you're not using like a voice chat, it's real easy for somebody to just like slip their phone out or slip over to another tab, and then oh, huh, what? It's my turn.
Yeah.
I drank a potion. All right, yeah, whatever.
Hmm.
Okay, go back to it. So keeping people engaged, it's knowing what they're looking for in D&D and kind of delivering on that. It's okay if you'll like say you have a player who doesn't really care for the combat too much. If they kind of space out a little bit during combat, I mean that's fine. That's not
Mhm.
what they're there for. As long as it's not too disruptive to everybody else, as long as their turn rolls around, they're able to do something, then it's okay if they're like a little bit distracted. But if you have a player who's more into the RP, like giving them good opportunities for their characters to shine will keep them engaged in the story that's going on. And also, like giving everybody their turn to shine really is the best way to keep them engaged.
Yeah, that's a good point. Make sure you keep them all interested.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's a great point. I am curious as far as, so obviously two of the most important things in D&D are Dungeons and Dragons. What do you try to focus on more? Which do you think is more important? Focusing on the enemies that you create or focusing on the actual places that these people are going to go, the design of dungeons as far as traps and things like that go? Do you try to focus more on the enemies that you're creating, the bosses and stuff? Do you try to focus more on the landscape of the dungeons?
I found it's best when you have a harmony between the two. Um, you can have very interesting encounters in very boring spaces. You can have very interesting spaces with very boring encounters. It's tricky to come up with a good combination of the two, but when they do blend together, it's pretty magical. Um, a lot of that's also going to depend on your group. Like if your group if you like put out a nice suite of miniatures, or you're online and you put out a really cool map, and then somebody just like drags their token all over it, like yeah, I just move over here and I attack the dragon. Like you gotta play
Yeah,
to like what your group's gonna do. And
makes sense.
Yeah. For me personally, though, I find it's a lot easier to put together interesting encounters than the environments themselves. Um,
Gotcha. Now, this is a kind of an off the wall question, but I got asked this, I think it was yesterday, and I think it's interesting. Um, what would you say, as far as you in real life, what would you say your highest stat is? You know, when we're looking at intelligence, wisdom, is it constitution, strength, uh, dex, and con, right? No, dex and
or strength, dex, con, int, whiz, charisma. Um,
charisma. Yeah, that's mine. I can't. How did I forget? What would you say? What do you think yours is?
this is always a fun thought experiment, like going through like, oh, if I was to stat myself out as a character, I mean, the first thing you got to do is you got to get over yourself. Like, you probably don't have more than a 14 or a 12 in like most of your stats.
Right.
I'd say I'd maybe my highest is probably like a wisdom with like a 13 would be
Yeah.
what I say. Yeah.
Nice.
Because if you're saying, oh, I've got a 20 in this, like 20 is supposed to be like some godly state, like Hercules.
Yeah,
Like,
like +5. Come on.
yeah, no, like most people you meet aren't going to be more than like a +2 at best. Um,
When you think about it, +5 for a 20, +5 is 25%. It's a 25% bump, right? Because if you're looking at on a D20, five adding five, that means you only need to get up to 15.
oh yeah.
So that's insane. Yeah, that's got to be like godlike. Um, what do you? So that's interesting. That brings up a question as a DM when you have characters rolling their well, players rolling their characters. What is your, I guess, mulligan rules? What are your mulligan rules? Like, how bad does a character have to? Does a player have to roll for them to get another shot? And I think like some DMs like to let you roll three or two and pick one. How do you do it?
So for InstaQuest, I was a little bit more generous than I usually am. I was like, okay, you can roll, but you can also take the array if you don't like your stats. But everybody who rolled ended up liking their stats, and everybody else just took the array. But when I'm running my own game, it's I don't really like point buy. Point buy is like a system you end up with everybody's just gonna get three 15s and three 8s. It doesn't make interesting characters. But for rolling, I always just like to tell them, hey, roll the dice. You get what you get. If you don't have any stats above 10, I have an innkeeper rule. where if you have all negative modifiers and everything's just zeros, just that character goes off and becomes an innkeeper somewhere.
It's a kobold.
Yeah.
uh, that's nice. That's fun. Um, so I guess we talked about a lot about your D&D experience, but what kind of experience do you have as a player?
As a player, unfortunately, I don't get to play in too many games. But when I do play, unfortunately I tend to be a little bit disruptive.
Oh,
um, uh, my longest running character was a dragonborn paladin sorcerer. We got up to like level 12, I think. Um,
nice.
off and on. We started like Tomb Annihilation, and then went on to like do our own little thing afterwards. And that character was a lot of fun because he had 6 intelligence, I think. Um,
Wow.
super super dumb, uh,
That's
but
fun.
but incredibly powerful outside of that, just because paladin
Well, he's a
source.
dragonborn, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I had his backstory. He was half dragon too. Just to throw that in the mix.
Why
But
not?
paladin sorcerer is just such a crazy like mix. If you put those two classes together, it's like dynamite.
Yeah,
Um,
and if when you're a dragonborn, you can add that breath attack into the mix, man, because the dragonborns are monsters. I played a dragonborn paladin, and those things are
oh yeah.
insane.
I mean
Yeah,
the breath attack falls off a little bit when you start attacking 4 times in a round and smiting on every single one of those, and
that makes sense. With
yeah.
coming from someone who like can never get past like level 5 in a campaign, the breath attack definitely helps. Uh, um, what what do you think well, let me ask you this before I forget. Have you ever kind of created your own class to try to run your own class that you kind of create from scratch? Like I've had people I know that have created like I think there was a monster hunter I play tested one time. Do you ever have any characters play test something that you try to build?
I've never actually built any classes myself. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. Like, I know people have done like full conversions for like Final Fantasy characters to do them in D&D, or like Fallout, or other sort of
Yeah.
adaptations. I've never done my own classes, but I've definitely done my own like magical items or weapons that I can give the characters that have like special abilities and things like that. Um, classes are tricky. They require a lot of playtesting and a lot of knowledge about the game, which is difficult to get just from playing with one group of people.
Yeah.
Because you can play test a new character and all that like in a setting, and then maybe there's one little word on the rules you didn't catch, so somebody out playing it out in the wild who's not going to have you to guide it, can easily like get led astray really quickly like that. um, One of the, I guess the closest I've ever really gotten to that is the like original 5e Mystic rules. It's a class they still haven't actually added to the game because they can't get it right.
Yeah.
They've done a couple of revisions of it and put it out as Unearthed Arcana, and it's either just like a completely broken mess or just like way too powerful, and they haven't quite dialed it in there yet. So um,
That's funny.
like
That's funny.
wizards can't even get dialed in a class very well. I think it's a little bit outside my ken.
And now, did you were talking about you create magical items and stuff. I know that you have like moonstones in InstaQuest.
Hmm.
Is that an item that you created? I think Lexi had Ember. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Ember had I think she said it was like a light bulb or like some kind of light that she had for her moonstone. I don't know. Is that an item that you created or is that an item that you pulled from the book and just like tried to create something for the InstaQuest?
For that first session InstaQuest, the moonstones I was giving them, the idea is that they're fonts of magical energy that can be attuned like a certain way. Um, they're a little bit more like tied into the plot, but for that session, like they're basically being used as like a scroll, basically, a bit
I
more of a
got you.
fancy version of a scroll, like a way you can cast a spell without having the spell itself.
Okay.
Um, but
Like a conduit almost, like a
yeah,
magical conduit. Cool.
exactly.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
or like a
Um,
magic grenade of some sort.
yeah. What kind of rules do you set for companions? Because I know that those can be really tricky. Um, maybe not so much as far as like a druid goes, because I feel like there's more specific rules for a druid's familiar, and it gets more tricky when players try to have a different kind of companion animal.
Mhm.
So what kind of rules do you use, or do you not really have a lot of people who have tried to bring that into your campaigns?
um, so with there's a nice little spell called like Find Familiar, which is actually really busted. It's a really good pickup if you can get that as like on any class really. If you
Yeah.
can get a feat to give you one spell to get Find Familiar, you can get a Owl Familiar, which is just the dumbest thing in the game. So owls have night vision; they can see in the dark.
Okay.
They have advantage on every perception check, and they have a passive ability called Flyby, where they don't provoke opportunity attacks if they're flying around something.
Yeah.
So I've had several characters who have their owl companions.
They're broken owl.
Yeah, yeah. Every single turn, what it does is I have my owl fly in, use the help action to give me advantage, and then come back. And then if they're a rogue, like, oh, I get sneak attack now. Boop. So
So do you tell them that they can't use owl? You gotta send that boy back to Hogwarts, or what's the deal? Do you let them use the owl because it's in the book?
it's
Or
it's in the rules. It's part of the game. I've never been like, no, you can't do that. That's horseshit. Because what ends up happening is just like whatever. I just kill the owl. Just kill it. Just have like
yeah,
one wizard character in there with magic missile every single time, ready to go. Like, oh, magic missile, the owl is gone. Oh, well, no, you got to spend an hour summoning it again. No, you can't do it this fight. Okay.
that's
Um,
hilarious. That's hilarious. Yeah, that's hilarious. So, as a DM, how do you find a balance of treating your players as themselves versus the character they're playing? Because it's like you said, you have to keep the players interested, but you also have to keep them in the fantasy world. So do you address them always by their character name? Do you try to keep them in conversation as character? Because I know you said you try to get the tea time out of the way ahead of time. um, how far do you go to try to keep them when you're not running like a mixed reality campaign where everybody's dressed as their class? How far do you go to? What kind of balance do you find between the two?
yeah, one trick I do definitely there is always calling them by the character name. Just like because you're referring to things that are happening in the game that are happening to their character. So it's like, hey, what is Gorthax doing? Not just
Hmm.
Hey Steve, what is Gorthax doing? Hey Gorthax, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Um, I think that's an important distinction to make. I also like to do voices a little bit, and having like something in world rather. So you have basically not only character voices, but you have different voices. You have your narrative voice, you have your judge voice where you're deciding rules, and then you have character voices for all the characters happening in the world. So having being able to distinguish between those three and like tell have your characters or players pick up on that is important. Like, hey, here's something I'm telling you about the setting of the world, and no, actually, you can't take a bonus action there. Yes, of course, you can take on my quest, and I'll give you 50 gold for it. Being able to have three kind of distinct ways of speaking is a good way to split them up, and then that's also a way to drill into keeping things in session. Like if you don't bring the judge voice out, people are more likely to be caught up in the actual scene and the things going on rather than thinking about numerical stats or things like that. Um,
Nice.
and also as a player, I always find doing a voice really helps stay in character, and also helps
Yeah.
differentiate between your narrative voice and your character voice.
Yeah, sure. Now, what kind of um what kind of I know that,
Also,
like,
hi everybody in the chat. I've been neglecting you a little bit, but Lexi just
oh,
showed up.
sorry.
Lexi just
Hey
showed up,
guys.
and Utah and KWK. Thank you all for coming by here.
Hey Bree. Hey Lexi. How you guys doing? I can't see your chat, so you guys can make fun of me and you guys can like talk all the crap you want to, and JB over here is just gonna laugh and chuckle along as we go. No, but seriously, if you guys have any questions in the chat, make sure that you guys, what do we ask? Throw a question in all caps so that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
notice what
that'll
you have to say.
yeah. If you do add InstaQuest or you put question in all caps, it'll be a little bit easier for me to pick up on because I'm running a few things right here, but I've got chat open. I'm keeping an eye on it. So.
Otherwise, we may neglect you, and that's on you. So, okay, so then as far as what do you think? I know that you have like Zen. Is it Zen? Zen?
Mhm.
Uh, you obviously created for InstaQuest. This question is a little more InstaQuest specific, sorry. But
It's
you've
okay.
created this Zen and like the people who worship Zen. Are there still like Asmodeus and other godly beings in this universe of InstaQuest, or is it in this universe? Is that the one above all?
In this setting, no. Part of like the setting here is that all the gods were killed in the harrowing, and only one of them survived. Now, if someone were to play a cleric character on the show, there's like remnants of the old gods they might be able to like pray to and get power from. But the specific like Forgotten Realms or the stock D&D pantheon, I'm not saying like exists on this plane. Ostensibly in D&D, there it's everything's connected, everything's in the same multiverse. There's a place for everything in Dungeons and Dragons, I think is the phrase they've used. So technically, the InstaQuest world is linked to Faerun and all that. But I don't think that's ever really going to come up in the show.
Okay. Now, let's say somebody's watching or listening to this 6 months from now, and pretend we're in a world with no pandemic. If there is someone who wants to attempt running a session, would you recommend that they do their first session online, or to try to sit down and do their very first session physically in person?
That's gosh, that's such a personal preference, really. Since I've been spoiled lately with all this online stuff, and I love being able to like just look up a rule instantly. Just be like, okay, nope, nope, you can't do that. When you're in person, and you have like the books out yourself, sure you might still have a computer there, you can still like have access to that. But I've always felt a little bit more comfortable just like being able to have the as many screens as I need and all the tabs open and all that to run a game. But in person, you definitely get a lot more. It's a lot easier for multiple people to talk at the same time. Like you can have a side conversation. You can pull someone to the other room. When two people are talking over each other, it doesn't just completely muddle everything. Um, but for somebody, if somebody's never run a game before and they want to run one for the first time, is it better in person or is it better online? Probably in person, I'd have to say.
Yeah.
If that was an option, it's just so much easier to get like immediate feedback from people, to get an immediate response to know if everybody's smiling, everybody's having a good time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and
if
as a host, that's just something. As a host, you got to make these people comfortable too. So that's a good point. Yeah, you're gonna want to get these people, I guess, used to the world where you can have them and control them, paying attention to you before you let them out onto the internet.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
I'm
maybe
also as KWK pointed out, I am actually 35% internet, so I do prefer the online lately. It's actually been pretty nice.
and maybe if somebody's new, maybe they should try both. Yeah, just to see,
Yeah.
one session, even just to try like a short session or character creation. They can try both and just see which works. I am curious for you, when you're not doing InstaQuest, again, not doing mixed reality, if you're running a campaign in your free time, do you like to implement audio to try to bring the world out, make it more real life for these people with less of an imagination than you, or is it pretty much up to them to envision everything?
Um, Definitely. I've always used music.
Okay.
Um, Music is a little bit tricky to nail. You want really ambient music. You don't want things with like a lot of vocals. You don't really want like too loud blasting music unless it's for like combat.
Hmm.
Combat's generally where I'll go with like more bombastic tracks, a little bit more like disruptive. Um, but
Bombastic. Nice
uh,
word.
thank you. But audio is definitely something I've done a lot with. And if you're playing online, visual becomes a thing, like being able to drag in pictures, visual references, maps, whatever you need. In person, having um, I've never really had a good like miniatures collection. I've always just used kind of like a wet erase mat, battle mat. But I mean, you can get like tons of crazy little like miniatures and things forged and pieced together and 3D printed, and there's definitely a lot of visual references you can have there as well. Um,
So I'll be honest. I think one of the toughest things that has always been, like, at least I've seen in campaigns that I've played, seems like one of the tougher things to nail down is money. Um, how do you how do you figure out the scope of money and really what a gold piece is worth? Because every world is different, and you're deciding how much money to put in these people's pockets really when you're setting the treasure aside. So how do you basically, how do you decide the value of a dollar?
um, this is definitely a problem I actually ran into in a Star Wars campaign where I gave them just like way too much money. I'm like, oh, the mafia is gonna come after him for it. Like I got all this money, and
Nice.
then they killed all the mafia, and then they had all this money. I'm like, oh, that's
Then
weird.
they got even more money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it
Well,
kind of
then what you have to do is present problems to them that they can't solve with money, or
yeah.
make an economic crisis. Like think of what happened in the world, right? It's like the value of a dollar has just become zero. Good
But
luck.
well, where the campaign actually ended up going is they ended up starting their own mercenary company. They like bought a base somewhere and started upgrading it. There's even if you mess up and you give them way too much money, there's you can find cool things and ways to kind of draw that out of the game. There's a lot of good gold sinks out there. Although unfortunately the core book itself doesn't really give that to you.
Yeah.
One good one out there is by Matthew Colville. There's it's Strongholds and Followers, I think it's called, or it might just be called Strongholds. But basically, it gives the players a bunch of rules and options for building a base, something to dump all that gold into. Um, but coming back around to the initial question, like how do you know the value of a gold piece in the world? There's like standards in the book. If you go through I think there's some of it in the player's handbook and more in the DMG. Like, hey, if you're living this sort of lifestyle, this is how much gold you'd be spending per week. And there's actually a like lifestyle expense optional rule you can have, where it's like, okay, if you want to live in the gutters and be a murder hobo, yeah, sure, you don't have to pay any gold. You can get along just fine. But if you don't want people to look at you funny and if you don't want to smell bad, then here's how much gold you're gonna have to pay each week to uphold a certain lifestyle. Um, and I found that works well in kind of more sandboxy types of games where you're just
Yeah.
letting people kind of like do whatever they want. But there's also if you mess up and give them too many golds, rust monsters are a thing. Those exist. They just
Really
there's these
nice.
nice little monsters that go around and they just oh, all your gold turned to rust. How weird. That's strange.
That's hilarious. They're probably a kobold too.
Oh yeah.
Um,
It's a kobold. He's got two of them on leashes and he's coming for you.
Nice. So I want to talk about natural. I want to talk about natural 20s and natural ones. Uh, those are really when you can do anything. Uh, I think it's funny because when we did the Fallout campaign that I was mentioning, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Fallout games, but there's a like a perk that you can get in the games called Wacky Wasteland. And so my friend who had like designed this Fallout D&D campaign, he put that you could pick up the feat Wacky Wasteland. And if you pick up that feat, natural 20s and natural ones would just be the most ridiculous thing that could happen in that situation. Um, so like how crazy do you like to make things when somebody happens to hit that high or low note?
Yeah, so there's some people who like using like critical failure charts or critical fumble charts where really bad things can happen to you if you fail, like you snap your bowstring or your bow breaks or something like that on a critical fail. I've always found that to be a little bit too punishing because it's already like, okay, you failed on whatever you were trying, and now let me just rub a little dirt in that as well. Like, I've always felt that was a little bit too much. For nat 20s for handling that, um, it's tricky because typically that means you get what you want. You've done as well as you possibly can. But if somebody's like, oh, I get my lasso out and I try to throw it around the dragon and pull it down out of the sky, and they crit that, um, it doesn't mean that they're gonna lasso the dragon and pull it down. I mean, it's like not a super feasible thing, but it's gonna go about as well as it can
Yeah.
when they get the nat 20.
Okay.
So either they're gonna be lasso the dragon and start riding it around, or they lasso the dragon and oh you can't hold on to it, the rope is slipping out of your hands. What do you do?
Hmm. Okay. And now, as a DM, I'm sure there's tons of things that you know about the game that I don't know, that I can't think of. What kind of tips, did you come into this stream, wanting to share with the audience, people, either players or people looking to try to be a DM themselves? What kind of tips did you want to bring to the table?
Yeah, some of the biggest tips I've got are be a fan of your players' characters. Um, even if you look over their sheet and like, gosh, this is the most boring, bland thing I've ever seen. You have to be a fan of them. You have to want to know what's going to happen next to them because we're playing to find out what happens next. Um,
And if you're
and
not interested, they're not going to be, right.
exactly, yeah, yeah. It's tricky sometimes because I've had some players who have very milk toast characters, and it's hard to.
Milk toast. That's even better than bombastic.
And it's becoming a fan of those characters and understanding, hey, your player made this character because they're interested in it. Why don't you get a little interested in it as well? If they're coming off as something boring, ask them questions. Find out something that you can get your hooks into and really like about that character and want to see them succeed or fail at doing.
Okay. Nice, nice. Um, is there anything that you would recommend not doing as a DM? Anything you would recommend like um,
Uh,
avoiding trying on their first time? Maybe basics that they should stick to and try to wait until they get a little better to try to implement. Any of the facets that are a little bit tougher that you think?
I would say if you're just getting started out, don't worry too much about the rules. Um, Definitely, especially if you're running a system that nobody else is familiar with. Like if you're like, hey, I want to run Blades in the Dark, but I don't know the rules. If you're running the game at that point, you need to know the rules. With D&D, you have a lot more leeway because it's just so much more familiar and common that if you have players who know the rules really well, you can kind of skate away with not knowing the rules too well. So if you're just getting into D&D and you have a group of veteran players and you're like, hey, I want to DM, I want to try to run something, don't worry about going through and memorizing every single page of the core rulebook. 'Cause that's a trap I kind of fell into for a little bit. For a while, I was just like devouring rule books. Like any
Hmm.
system I could get on, I would read it cover to cover all the way through, and like, okay, I got this, I got this, I got this. And what actually burned me on that was the fifth edition playtest. They did like a beta for it was called D&D Next before fifth edition came out, and it was like every couple of weeks or every month they would put out a new packet, and each one was about like either between 20 to 100 pages, depending on how far into the beta it was. And I would read the whole thing and internalize it. And then another one would come out next week, and I read the whole 100 pages and internalize it. And just by the end of it, that just completely burned me on devouring rule books as I did before.
Man, man, I bet. Now, I know that we've been on here for almost an hour, but I did want to ask and kind of address, there's so many things, I guess, people who are looking D&D stuff up online, if they try to get dice, there's so many things, apps or things that they can use. You can buy cards, like spell cards that have spells on them. You can buy, there's tons of miniatures you can get. There's all types of different kinds of dice. You can get apps that like let you like put your character information in and kind of keep on your phone with the different skills. What do you think? Because there's so many things that you can use to try to help you when starting. What would you recommend? What do you think will make both players and DM's job a little bit easier?
For DMs, I typically don't play with a DM screen because I
Hmm.
just like to roll out in the open. But a DM screen can have a lot of really good rules reference on the inside of it. So I mean, not necessarily if you're going to use the screen to block your rolls or not, but having something that you can quickly refer to different rules is a very handy tool to have. For players, I've always been a fan of spell cards. Spell cards are a really good way to quickly reference like your spells and the abilities that your characters have. Because if you're not too familiar with a class yet and you haven't played around with it a whole lot, you're not going to know exactly what your spells can do. And sometimes when you're casting a spell in a very strange situation, it's going to come down to the minutia of the legalese and the spell on how it's actually going to function or not.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That's a good point. Is there anything that we need to address in the chat?
Um, yes, I am using big words. Killed with kindness. Thank you very much. And become a fan of their second character after you kill their first sparring one. I mean, that's I might have done that once. But it can actually be kind of tricky to like specifically targetedly kill one character and make it not seem like DM Fiat to get away with murder like that. Um, and I mean to make it not look like DM magic. It's tricky. It's tricky. I wouldn't recommend it. Because that's being mean to your player. They've made this character. They're investing into it. Um, don't just straight up murder it off without a good reason.
Let them play.
Yeah,
Let
exactly.
them have fun. Um, yeah, I did want to ask this question. I think it's interesting if, let's say, there's one of your players in your party that you're running ends up following a path that like directly contradicts what the other players are doing. Do you separate those two groups of people and say, okay, now you're both going to do whatever you want. This is going to affect each other however it does, or do you try to be like, look, guys, you're gonna take this campaign off course. You guys need to work together. How do you do that? What do you do?
I mean, if they're just splitting up, I'm okay with that. I've definitely had sections and campaigns where physically the player characters are physically separated from each other in different places, and you just kind of like flash between them. But if the characters themselves are getting at odds with each other, if like oh I want to save the princess or I want to kill the princess, um, it's important to first take a step back, talk to the players, be like, hey, you know, there's some conflict here. You guys are gonna be running up against each other. Are you both cool with this? What's going on? And if make sure that before any sort of PvP sort of scenario could even crop up, any sort of player versus player thing, make sure that there's consent between the players. That it's not just sudden backstabbing and things like that. That can get real dirty, real quick, and real nasty.
I bet I can
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah. So it's important to take that step back, be like, okay, and then once you get back into it, it can be a lot of fun. Having inter-party conflicts is a great way to have drama, and it's great as a DM because you just like, okay, you two are in a room and you hate each other, go. You just kind of sit back, be like, all right, you guys got the rest of this session, and it'll take them a few hours for them to hash it out.
Take it from here.
Yeah,
I'm gonna grab an apple juice.
yeah.
Is there anything else in the chat that we need to address, or is that pretty
um,
much everything?
No, no, not too many questions in the chat here, but thank you all
Cool.
for coming out and supporting and chatting and being a part of this whole experience here, and thank you, Joe, for coming on and
For
helping
sure.
run this whole thing here.
Anytime, brother.
Yes,
Anytime.
Valexion, yes, you may ask a mechanics question, though I may not have the answer, but I'll answer it as best I can here. You want to sneak one in at the buzzer there, because
And
mechanics
oh,
questions can be tricky because like you have to know what's going to work best at your table. Um, because some people are only going to follow like exactly by the rules, by the numbers. Da da da. Here's this tweet from Jeremy Crawford that says no, you can't do that, or yes, I can do that. um, people can get really dialed in on that. Um, Turn one action surge, does it proc Dread Ambusher? That's a good question. Let's look up Dread Ambusher and specifically get into it, because when you get into a question like that, it's important to get into the minutia. So Dread Ambusher is a
And
it's a
while he's looking that
Gloomstalker.
up, make sure you guys, if there's like, if you guys want to learn more, if you guys want to see another one of these, make sure you guys leave that in the chat. Or if there's something else you guys want to learn, tips for players, anything else, put that in the chat too. Because the next episodes, I don't think till December. So, if you guys want to see other kinds of content, you let us know. We'll be happy to bring it out to you.
Oh yeah,
Um,
definitely.
now let's delve into, you were looking that up.
Yeah. So okay, so the specific wording on this Dread Ambusher is if you take the attack action on that turn, which is the first turn of combat, you can make one additional weapon attack as part of the action, and it does some extra damage. So it says if you take the attack action. So on your turn, what you do is you take the attack action, proc Dread Ambusher. You action surge, you take the attack action. You're still in the same turn. I'd say it would proc Dread Ambusher, but for very specific things like that, there's a I don't know what the exact word for it, but it's called Sage Advice, where it's basically people have taken a bunch of, I think it's a blog, I guess would be the word for it, where people have taken like all these tweets and all these specific statements from like the designers of the game, for like Jeremy Crawford and all them, and they've like compiled it together. So I definitely say look up, your mechanic, like I'd say like for that one, like Dread Ambush or Sage Advice, you might be able to pull up a more specific ruling. That's how I
Is
would.
that a subreddit?
um
Like r/sage advice?
I don't think so. I
I was gonna
always
say
I always
it
just like
sounds
search for
like
it and it shows
I
up.
was gonna say that sounds like a subreddit. Like I don't even read it Reddit, but my girlfriend does
Okay.
nonstop. So she's usually like, "Oh, this is a subreddit." When you said, sage advice, I'm like, "Oh, that's got to be a subreddit." um, especially if you say it's like a collection of information. I just feel like that's where the internet goes now. The internet goes to Reddit.
Oh yeah. Actually, I think it's something that D&D might put out. I don't know. I was just pull it up by just like searching. I don't exactly know what its format would technically be
Okay,
classified as. It's a website of some sort.
gotcha. If you have the internet, you can probably find it. If
uh,
you have a phone, you could probably find it. Um,
Assassin Fighter Gloomstalker for multi-attack stealth archer. That would be pretty nuts. That sounds vicious.
was that in the chat? What
Yeah,
is
yeah.
it?
Valexian, who was asking about Dread Ambusher. He's got a build.
Uh,
He's got a build he's working on. That one sounds
gotcha.
pretty slick. Check it out. I'd say go with it, build it out, and see if your DM will let you run it.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, was there anything else that you wanna focus on? Want to bring up? Because here's the thing, I can ask questions all day, but I know that we're already
Oh yeah, I guess we're
past the hour point.
we're a little
So
bit over
like,
time already. But
and
yeah,
the thing is, I could go all day, so you got to stop me because once you put a coin in me, man, you got to let that whole song play.
all right. Well, I guess we'll have to
So
save something for next time.
yeah, for
We'll
sure.
we'll have to do this again. This
Mhm.
was a lot of fun. So yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
definitely, man.
once again.
Anytime,
Thanks everybody in chat for coming by and watching and supporting, and thanks Joe for coming on and asking all the questions and
definitely.
keeping all this
Yeah,
dialogue
definitely.
going.
Yeah, man. I hope that we can do more stuff because InstaQuest has a lot coming for it, and I can't wait to see where it goes.
All right. Well, until next time.
For sure, man. Stay out of trouble.
You too.